If the kingdom wanted a monster, Damien Cole had decided to give them one who refused to beg. The bells of Valeria rang 12 times as he stood beneath the marble arch in the center of Crown Square, wrists bound in silver ribbon and 1,000 angry voices pressing against him like winter wind. Snow drifted over the rooftops, soft and almost beautiful, which felt insulting considering the occasion. Damien lifted his chin and studied the crowd instead of the ceremonial platform behind him. Merchants, soldiers, noble families, even children perched on their parents' shoulders had come to watch the infamous Shadow Mage receive the judgment everyone believed he deserved. 3 years ago, the Night of Black Ash had swallowed half the Eastern District in smoke and strange magic. Hundreds had lost their homes. Dozens had vanished. By sunrise, Damien had been found alone at the center of the ruined estate, covered in ash and surrounded by symbols only he could read. That had been enough for the court. It had been enough for the newspapers. It had been enough for every frightened citizen who needed a villain more than they needed the truth. "Any final words?" the royal official asked. Damien glanced at him. The poor man looked more nervous than Damien felt, which was almost funny. "Yes," Damien said. The square quieted. He looked toward the royal balcony, where Queen Evelyn sat beneath a white fur cloak, her expression arranged into perfect sorrow. Only her eyes betrayed her. Calm, certain, victorious. Damien smiled at her. "Your clock is 7 minutes slow." A confused murmur rolled through the crowd. The official stared. "That is all. I was promised noon," Damien replied. "I dislike poor scheduling." A few people gasped. Someone shouted that he had no remorse. Damien almost laughed. Remorse was a luxury for people whose truth had been heard. He had tried once, in a locked courtroom, to explain what happened that night. He had spoken of a hidden chamber beneath the Ashbourne estate, of a spell designed to reach the royal bloodline, of the woman whose perfume smelled like winter roses. The judges had called it desperation. Queen Evelyn had called it madness. After that, Damien stopped offering them pieces of himself they had already decided to burn. The official raised one hand, signaling that the ceremony would continue. Damien closed his eyes. Not because he was afraid, he told himself, but because he wanted his last memory to be silence instead of hatred. Then the sound came. Not the final bell. Hooves striking stone. Fast. Heavy. Approaching. The crowd broke into startled whispers as royal guards entered the square, their white and gold cloaks snapping behind them. At their center rode a man Damien had seen only in portraits and distant ceremonies. Crown Prince Julian Hart dismounted before the horse had fully settled. He wore no crown, only a dark military coat dusted with snow, and his pale blue eyes were fixed on Damien with an intensity that made the entire square disappear. "Stop the ceremony," Julian ordered. The official went white. Queen Evelyn rose sharply on the balcony. "Your Highness," she called, "this judgment was approved by the crown." Julian walked straight to Damien, drew his ceremonial sword, and brought it down against the silver ribbon binding Damien's wrists. The ribbon fell away. Gasps spread through the square. Damien flexed his freed hands and stared at the prince. "You are either very brave," he murmured, "or catastrophically stupid." Julian stepped beside him, facing the crowd as if he had expected that answer. "Anyone who wants Damien Cole dead," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square, "will have to kill me first." For one breathless moment, Crown Square forgot how to make a sound. Then every voice returned at once. Nobles shouted from the balcony, guards exchanged uncertain looks, and the crowd surged with questions that no one dared ask clearly. Damien stood beside Julian with the severed silver ribbon at his feet, wondering whether freedom was supposed to feel less like stepping into another trap. Queen Evelyn descended the balcony stairs with measured grace, her white cloak trailing behind her like fresh snow. "Julian," she said, soft enough to sound concerned and sharp enough to be a warning, "you are challenging a lawful judgment before the entire kingdom." Julian did not look at her. "I am correcting one." Damien turned his head slightly. "You should know that rescuing me will damage your reputation. I have survived worse." "Have you?" Damien asked. Julian finally met his gaze, and something unreadable passed between them. Not pity, not fear, recognition. The royal council gathered near the platform, their robes bright against the gray afternoon. Lord Whitmore, the oldest among them, raised his staff. Your Highness, the prisoner was convicted by royal decree. You cannot simply claim him and expect the court to obey. Then I will not simply claim him, Julian said. He removed the black glove from his right hand and pressed his palm over the crest embroidered above his heart. The air changed. Damien felt it first as a quiet pressure behind his ribs, like a distant bell vibrating through stone. Pale gold light traced the royal seal beneath Julian's hand. The council members stepped back. Even Queen Evelyn lost her perfect composure. Do not, she said. Julian spoke in the old language of the First Kings, each word calm and deliberate. Damien understood only fragments. Name, blood, protection. Then Julian reached for him. Damien should have moved away. Every instinct told him to. Instead, he remained still as Julian placed 2 fingers against the center of his chest. Warmth spread beneath Damien's coat, startling and immediate. Damien Cole stands under my name, my blood, and my protection, Julian declared. His life will answer to mine, and mine to his, until truth releases us both. Golden light flashed across the square. Damien inhaled sharply as a mark formed beneath his shirt, not painful, but impossibly bright, as though someone had drawn sunlight directly onto his skin. Julian's expression tightened at the same moment. A matching glow appeared beneath his collar. Lord Whitmore whispered, "The sovereign's vow." The crowd quieted again, this time with fear. Damien looked from the stunned council to Julian. You tied your life to a convicted villain in front of witnesses. Yes. That is not brave, Damien said. That is deeply unwise. A faint, almost invisible smile touched Julian's mouth. You mentioned that. Queen Evelyn stepped closer. This vow cannot be undone by ordinary decree. I know. And if he betrays you? Julian's eyes remained on Damien. Then I will face the consequence. Damien hated the certainty in his voice. He hated even more that part of him wanted to believe it. Royal guards formed a protective circle around them, but Julian dismissed the carriage waiting near the square and chose to walk beside Damien through the palace gates. Snow settled across Damien's dark hair. Neither man spoke until the doors closed behind them. Then Damien stopped beneath the vaulted ceiling and drew a small pin from the torn edge of his sleeve. Before Julian could question him, Damien pressed it lightly against his thumb. A red mark appeared on Julian's hand. They both stared at it. Damien's voice dropped to a whisper. You did not protect me. Julian slowly closed his fingers around the mark. No, Damien looked up. You made certain neither of us can escape. A prison with silk curtains is still a prison, Damien said as the doors to Julian's private wing closed behind them. The prince glanced at the enormous windows, the polished oak furniture, and the fire glowing beneath a white marble mantel. Most prisoners do not receive 3 bedrooms. Most prisoners are not magically attached to the future king. Damien crossed the room and tested the balcony doors. Locked. Naturally. Beyond the glass, the palace gardens stretched beneath fresh snow, beautiful in the cold, distant way expensive things often were. Julian removed his coat and handed it to a waiting servant. You are not forbidden from leaving. Excellent. You are forbidden from leaving without me. Damien looked back at him. That sounded remarkably similar. Before Julian could answer, 2 men entered. The first wore the dark blue uniform of the Royal Guard and carried suspicion as if it were part of the dress code. Captain Mason Reed was tall, broad-shouldered, and clearly disappointed that Damien had survived the afternoon. The second man appeared younger, with brown curls, crooked spectacles, and an armful of documents balanced against his chest. Oliver Grant, he said brightly. Royal Archivist. Occasional advisor, and apparently the only person in this palace willing to acknowledge how strange this is. Mason frowned. This is not amusing. A convicted shadow mage living with the crown prince because their lives are connected by ancient magic? Oliver adjusted his papers. It is at least a little amusing. Julian ignored them both and placed a sealed folder on the table. Inside were sketches from the night of Black Ash, witness statements, and photographs of symbols carved beneath the Ashbourne estate. Damien's humor vanished. He leaned over the pages, tracing the shapes without touching them. These records were sealed. I unsealed them, Julian said. Why? Because a dead man cannot prove his innocence. Damien remembered those words from the square. They sounded different here, surrounded by evidence no one had allowed him to see. He studied the largest symbol, a circle divided by 7 narrow lines. This was not designed to destroy the district. It was designed to reach one person. Mason stepped closer. Who? Damien lifted his eyes toward Julian. Someone with royal blood. Silence tightened around the table. Julian showed no fear, but Damien noticed his hand closing slowly near his side. A moment later, pain pressed beneath Damien's ribs, dull and sudden. Julian turned away. Damien caught his wrist. What was that? Nothing. Your definition of nothing is unusually painful. Julian tried to pull free, but Damien held on and pushed back the edge of his sleeve. Thin black lines curled beneath Julian's pale skin, branching upward like cracks in frozen glass. Oliver stopped smiling. Mason went still. Damien released Julian's wrist only to place his palm near the mark. The golden vow beneath his own shirt warmed in response. This is a royal decay curse, Damien said quietly. It has been feeding on you for years. Julian's expression remained calm, but exhaustion flickered behind his eyes. 3 years, he admitted. The same amount of time Damien had spent imprisoned. The same amount of time since the night of Black Ash. Damien looked again at the symbols spread across the table and understood why Julian had risked everything in Crown Square. You did not rescue me because you believed I was innocent. Julian met his gaze. I rescued you because you are the only person alive who might know why I am dying. 3 nights later, the palace ballroom glittered as if nothing in Valeria had ever burned. Hundreds of candles floated beneath the painted ceiling. Musicians played behind a wall of white roses, and nobles moved across the polished floor in silver masks and carefully practiced smiles. Damien stood beside Julian near the royal dais, dressed in black formal wear chosen by someone with expensive taste and a cruel sense of humor. I look like a decorative threat, he murmured. Julian kept his gaze on the approaching ambassadors. You look appropriate. That is the least reassuring compliment I have ever received. Since discovering the curse, Damien had spent every waking hour studying the sealed records, but the symbols refused to reveal their final purpose. Tonight, Julian had insisted they attend the Winter Accord celebration because canceling would suggest weakness. Damien had argued that dying at a party seemed worse for public confidence. Julian had almost smiled. Almost. Captain Mason remained within 10 feet of them, watching Damien more closely than the guests. Oliver drifted through the crowd collecting gossip and desserts with equal dedication. Queen Evelyn stood beneath the royal crest, gracious and luminous, receiving praise from people who had never seen the cold certainty behind her eyes. Damien felt her attention settle on him more than once. Each time, the mark beneath his shirt warmed. Something is wrong, he whispered. Julian's posture did not change. The vow. No. The room. Damien searched the mirrors, the balconies, the servants carrying crystal glasses. The music continued, bright and elegant, while unease crawled across his skin. Then every candle flame bent in the same direction, toward Julian. Damien moved before thought could interfere. He stepped between the prince and the center of the ballroom as a thin wave of enchanted light swept across the floor. It looked harmless, almost beautiful, but the curse beneath Julian's collar responded with a dark pulse. Damien raised both hands. Shadows spilled from his palms, spreading like smoke beneath moonlight, folding around the golden spell before it could reach Julian. The ballroom went silent. Guests backed away. Someone whispered, "Monster." Damien's magic trembled around him, vast and black, the same power the kingdom had blamed for the night of Black Ash. He could feel every fearful stare. For one terrible second, he was back in the courtroom, speaking to people who had already chosen what he was. The enchanted light faded, but Damien's knees weakened. Julian caught him before he reached the floor. The prince lowered himself beside him without concern for protocol, one arm steady around Damien's shoulders. "Look at me," Julian said quietly. Damien tried to make a joke, but his voice failed. Julian removed one glove and pressed his hand over Damien's, anchoring the fading shadows between their palms. "You saved me." Around them, the nobles remained frozen. Mason ordered the doors sealed. Oliver hurried toward the musicians, where one abandoned silver mask rested beside an open service passage. Queen Evelyn watched from across the ballroom, her expression unreadable. Another voice called Damien dangerous. Julian rose slowly, helping Damien stand with him. His pale eyes swept across the room. "The man you fear just protected every person here from an attack meant for the crown," he said. "Anyone who calls him a monster in my presence will answer to me." Damien looked at Julian, startled by the anger beneath his calm voice. Julian did not release his hand. For the first time in 3 years, the room was afraid of someone other than Damien. Damien woke to the scent of cedar smoke and the deeply inconvenient realization that he was not in his own bed. Pale morning light filtered through tall curtains, warming a room decorated in white, gold, and the kind of quiet wealth that made touching anything feel financially irresponsible. His formal coat had been folded across a chair. A clean bandage circled his right hand, though he could not remember anyone tending to it. He pushed himself upright and immediately felt a dull ache beneath his ribs. Across the room, Julian sat beside the fireplace with several sealed reports open across his knees. He was still wearing the dark shirt from the celebration, his collar loosened and his sleeves rolled to his elbows. The black lines of the curse were faintly visible along his wrist. "You look terrible," Damien said. Julian looked up. "You lost consciousness in the middle of a ballroom. And yet I still look better than you. Your confidence survived. It has endured worse conditions." Damien glanced around again. "Why am I in your room? The vow would not allow more than 30 feet between us while you were unconscious. So the ancient magic demanded shared accommodations. You were placed in the bed. I remained in the chair." Julian said it with such careful precision that Damien felt briefly ashamed for teasing him. Briefly. How noble. How exhausting. Damien noticed a shallow cut across Julian's palm, matching the place where his own skin had been marked by the spell. He reached for Julian's hand without thinking. Julian went still, but did not pull away. Damien turned the hand toward the light and studied the dark lines beneath the skin. They had spread farther since the previous night. "Using my magic strengthened your curse," Damien said. "Temporarily. You say that as though temporary dying is comforting." Julian's mouth tightened. Damien released him and looked toward the reports. One page showed a charcoal sketch of a burned schoolhouse from the night of Black Ash. Another contained the names of children rescued before the Eastern District was sealed. Damien recognized every name. "Why do you have these?" he asked. Julian closed the folder slowly. "Because the official account never made sense. The court found that detail very easy to overlook. I did not." Julian moved to the edge of the bed, leaving several careful inches between them. "The records claimed you caused the disaster, yet witnesses saw you carrying children out of the Ashbourne estate before the royal guard arrived. One child said you covered him with your own coat and returned inside for his sister." Damien stared at the fire. "Children remember strange things when they are frightened." He remembered your name. The room became painfully quiet. Damien had spent 3 years building himself into someone accusations could not wound. Julian was dismantling that armor with facts, and somehow kindness felt more dangerous than hatred. "You investigated me for 3 years," Damien said. "Yes." "Why?" Julian's answer came without hesitation. "Because monsters do not run into burning buildings to save strangers." Damien looked at him then. The prince appeared exhausted, guarded, and completely sincere. His hand rested between them on the blanket, close enough that Damien could feel the warmth without touching it. For one unsteady moment, the distance seemed to disappear. Julian's gaze dropped briefly to Damien's face, then returned to his eyes. Damien forgot the clever remark waiting on his tongue. Julian leaned closer, stopping before the space between them became a promise neither had spoken. Then he moved back. "The vow took away many of your choices," he said quietly. "I will not take another." Damien watched him rise and cross toward the window. The refusal should have brought relief. Instead, Damien touched the place above his heart where the golden mark rested and realized the most dangerous thing in the palace might not be Julian's curse. It might be the growing possibility that the prince had saved him for reasons neither of them was ready to name. The hidden archive beneath the western tower smelled of dust, old wax, and secrets that had been waiting too long to breathe. Damien followed Julian down a narrow staircase lit by blue glass lamps, each step pulling them farther from the warmth of the palace and deeper into records the royal family had never intended anyone else to see. Oliver had found the entrance behind a false wall in the council library, then wisely announced that he had urgent business somewhere with better air and fewer cursed documents. Mason remained outside the door, officially guarding Julian and unofficially making certain Damien did not disappear with the kingdom's darkest history. Inside, rows of iron shelves stretched into shadow. Julian placed a lantern on a stone table and unlocked a black case bearing the royal seal. "These are the original reports from the night of Black Ash," he said. Damien stared at the case. The court claimed the originals were destroyed. The court lied. That is becoming an exhausting pattern. They worked in silence for nearly an hour, comparing witness statements, spell diagrams, and supply orders from the Ashbourne estate. Damien found missing pages, altered dates, and payments routed through noble families loyal to Queen Evelyn. Every discovery tightened something in his chest. Julian stood across from him, reading with the same controlled focus he brought to everything. But the vow carried traces of his tension like distant thunder beneath Damien's ribs. Then Damien opened a thin ledger wrapped in gray cloth. A folded command rested inside. The paper had been preserved with royal magic. At the top was an order authorizing the transfer of restricted spell materials to the Ashbourne estate 3 days before the disaster. At the bottom was a signature Damien knew from every decree issued during his imprisonment. Julian Hart. Damien read it twice, then a third time, because betrayals sometimes required repetition before the mind agreed to accept it. "What is this?" His voice sounded too calm. Julian looked up. The color left his face when he saw the page. "Damien, listen to me. You signed the order." "I did not. Your seal is here." Damien pushed the document across the table. "Your name. Your hand. Your authority." Julian reached for it, but Damien stepped back. The golden mark beneath his shirt burned, reacting to the fear neither of them wanted to show. "I was 17, Julian said. "I had no access to these materials. Yet someone used your name, and 3 years later you rescued the only person who could identify the spell. I rescued you because I believed you were innocent. You rescued me because your curse was getting worse." Julian moved around the table. "Both things can be true." Damien laughed once, without humor. "That is a remarkably elegant answer." The signature was forged. "Of course it was. Look at me." Julian's voice softened, which only made the hurt sharper. Damien wanted to believe him. That was the problem. Belief had become more dangerous than suspicion. He lifted one hand, and the shadows along the archive walls stirred. The protective seal on the door flickered. Julian stopped. "Do not leave. You do not get to ask that." "Then I am asking anyway." Damien broke the seal and walked into the corridor. The vow pulled painfully between them, but he kept moving. By the time he reached the old garden beyond the palace wall, snow had begun to fall. Figures stepped from the trees wearing plain gray cloaks. Damien recognized the symbol stitched inside one sleeve, the same 7-line circle from the Ashbourne records. Before he could call out, the golden mark beneath his shirt flared. Miles away inside the palace, Julian collapsed beside the forged order, one hand pressed to his heart as Damien finally understood that someone had expected him to find the signature and leave. The figures in gray did not rush Damien. They simply raised their hands, and the snow beneath his boots turned silver, locking his shadow in place. The magic was cold rather than painful, but every attempt to move tightened the invisible pressure around him. "You arranged the document," Damien said. One figure lowered his hood, revealing a palace servant Damien had passed every morning without noticing. Her Majesty arranged everything. A carriage waited beyond the trees. Damien was taken beneath the old chapel, into a chamber carved with the same 7-line circle from the Ashbourne estate. Queen Evelyn stood at its center in a gown as white as the snow outside. "I wondered how long Julian would take to find the archive," she said. "I overestimated him. Or perhaps I underestimated you." Damien looked at the symbols surrounding his feet. The signature was forged. "Beautifully. You used his name to obtain the spell materials." Evelyn smiled. "A future king is useful long before he wears a crown." The truth settled into place with terrible clarity. The hidden chamber. The winter rose perfume. The curse aimed at royal blood. "You caused the night of Black Ash." "I attempted to bind the throne to me," she corrected. "The spell was meant to make Julian dependent on my magic. Then you interfered." Damien remembered smoke filling the Ashbourne halls, frightened children calling from behind sealed doors, and dark power reaching toward the palace. He had drawn the spell into himself because there had been no time to destroy it. "I contained it," he said. "You absorbed most of it, Evelyn replied. That is why your magic changed. That is why everyone found it so easy to believe you were the monster. Damien closed his eyes briefly. 3 years of accusations, silence, and locked doors had been built upon the choice that saved people who later demanded his death. Through the vow, he felt Julian's fear approaching like thunder. The prince was alive, coming closer. You should leave, Damien told her. Julian knows where I am. Of course he does. I need him here. Evelyn touched the carved circle, and gold light spread across the floor. The sovereign's vow is older than your record suggested. It cannot awaken through strategy, obligation, or deception. The heir must name someone his true weakness, and the magic must recognize the feeling beneath the words. Damien stared at her. No, Julian did not bind himself to you merely because you could study his curse. Her smile sharpened. He loved you before he ever entered Crown Square. Memories returned with new meaning. Julian investigating witnesses for 3 years. Julian remembering the children Damien saved. Julian stopping inches away in the quiet of his bedroom because he refused to take another choice from him. Damien's heart struck hard against his ribs. You are lying. Ask him. The chapel doors opened above them. Julian descended the stairs with Mason and Oliver behind him, his face pale from the strain of the vow, but his steps steady. His eyes found Damien immediately. Relief broke through his composure so openly that Damien forgot every accusation he had prepared. Evelyn raised one hand, and the glowing circle separated Julian from the others. Tell him, she said. Tell the kingdom's villain why its perfect prince was willing to share his grave. Julian looked only at Damien. Because I saw what everyone else refused to see, he said quietly. Because you kept saving people who would never thank you. Because every report they used to condemn you gave me another reason to believe you. Damien's voice nearly failed. That is not an answer. Julian stepped into the circle, accepting its light without hesitation. Then here is the answer. I loved you before you knew my name. Julian's confession seemed to silence even the ancient magic beneath the chapel. Damien stared at him across the glowing circle, unable to decide which was more dangerous, the trap around them or the hope rising inside his chest. Queen Evelyn recovered first. How touching, she said. Now let us discover whether love makes him loyal or merely foolish. The symbols beneath Damien brightened, and the golden mark over his heart tightened like a warning. Evelyn held out a ceremonial blade, its silver surface reflecting the chapel lights. The vow can be broken by willing betrayal, she said. Renounce him, sever the bond, and walk away free. Refuse, and the curse will consume you both before sunrise. Julian stepped forward, but the circle stopped him. Mason and Oliver searched the stone walls for another entrance while Evelyn placed the blade in Damien's hand. Choose, she ordered. Damien looked at Julian. The prince's calm had finally cracked, leaving fear exposed in his pale blue eyes. Not fear for himself. Fear for Damien. Do not do what she wants, Julian said. That is terrible advice from a man who walked directly into a magical trap. Damien, you should have told me. I know. You should have trusted me. I know. Damien swallowed. You should not have made it so difficult to leave you. Julian's expression softened with unbearable tenderness. I know. Damien turned toward Evelyn and lowered his head. I accept. The queen smiled. Behind Julian, Mason shouted a warning, but Damien was already moving. He crossed the circle and raised the blade toward the prince's chest. Julian did not step away. He did not defend himself. He simply watched Damien approach with the quiet faith of someone placing his life into another person's hands. The blade touched the golden mark over Julian's heart. Damien whispered, "Trust me one more time." Then he turned the blade sideways and drew it through the light, connecting them. The chapel shook. Golden threads rose from the floor, revealing a darker web hidden beneath them, every strand leading back to Evelyn. Her smile vanished. Damien had never intended to break the sovereign's vow. He had used the blade to separate Evelyn's curse from it. The black lines beneath Julian's skin flowed into the silver edge, then crossed toward Damien, gathering around his hands like smoke. What have you done? Evelyn demanded. Corrected your spell, Damien said, though his voice trembled. The darkness moved into him, heavy with 3 years of fear and stolen power. His knees weakened. Julian caught him, but the curse climbed Damien's arms faster than he could contain it. Let go, Damien whispered. It will take you too. Then it takes us together. Julian pressed his palm over Damien's glowing mark. The royal light answered immediately, pouring through their joined hands. Damien tried to pull away. Julian held on. You were never the weakness that could destroy me, he said. You were the only reason I still wanted to survive. Light and shadow filled the chapel, not fighting, but folding into each other like night meeting dawn. The hidden web around Evelyn dissolved. The circle beneath them went dark. When the last trace of the curse vanished, Damien found himself still standing in Julian's arms. Evelyn's control was gone. The chapel doors were open, and the first light of morning had begun to touch the stairs. Damien looked up at Julian, exhausted and unsteady. That was an extremely dramatic declaration. Julian rested his forehead gently against Damien's. You bring out the worst in me. For the first time, Damien smiled without using it as armor. Good, he whispered. I was beginning to think I was the only one. By sunrise, the bells of Valeria were ringing for a reason no one in the capital had expected. Queen Evelyn was placed under royal guard. The hidden records were carried from the chapel, and Oliver spent the morning organizing enough evidence to make the entire council look as though it had forgotten how to speak. Damien sat beside a tall window in Julian's private wing, wrapped in a blanket he had repeatedly insisted he did not need. Snow melted along the palace roofs while warm light spread across the city. Julian stood nearby, reading the official declaration that cleared Damien of every charge connected to the Night of Black Ash. You have reached the part where the kingdom apologizes, Julian said. Damien accepted the document and examined the royal seal. The kingdom has terrible handwriting. That is your response. I spent 3 years waiting for the truth. I expected it to have better penmanship. Julian sat across from him, close enough for the golden vow between them to feel like quiet sunlight rather than a chain. The dark lines of the curse had disappeared from his skin. For the first time since Damien had met him, the prince looked rested. The council wants to restore your title and compensate you for your imprisonment, Julian said. Can they restore 3 years? Julian's expression softened. No, Damien folded the declaration carefully. Then they can begin by helping the families displaced from the Eastern District. Rebuild the schoolhouse first. It is already being arranged. Damien looked at him. Of course it is. In the weeks that followed, the truth traveled beyond the palace walls. Witnesses who had remained silent came forward. The children Damien had rescued, older now, spoke his name without fear. Some citizens offered apologies. Others avoided his eyes. Damien accepted neither worship nor pity. He simply walked through Crown Square beside Julian, no silver ribbon around his wrists, while the same people who had once demanded his judgment watched him return as a free man. 3 months later, the palace opened its doors for Julian's coronation. White banners crossed the great hall, sunlight filled the stained glass windows, and every noble family in Valeria gathered beneath the royal crest. Damien waited near the front in a formal black coat, pretending not to notice Oliver smiling at him or Mason standing nearby with something dangerously close to approval. Julian approached the throne wearing the ceremonial crown, but before he sat, he turned toward Damien. Come here, he said. Damien glanced at the hundreds of witnesses. You have developed an unfortunate habit of making personal decisions in public. You have developed an unfortunate habit of standing too far away. A quiet laugh moved through the hall. Damien walked forward and stopped below the dais. Tradition required him to kneel. Julian extended his hand instead. Damien Cole, he announced. I name you Royal Protector of Valeria and invite you to stand beside the throne as my chosen consort, if that is what you choose. Choice. The words settled gently between them. Damien took Julian's hand and stepped onto the dais. Still willing to let the entire kingdom believe I am your weakness? He whispered. Julian's fingers closed warmly around his. No. Now I want them to know you are my strength. The hall rose in applause, but Damien heard only Julian's voice. He looked at the man who had crossed a crowded square for him, trusted him inside a chapel of lies, and offered him a future without demanding anything in return. Damien smiled, not as armor and not as defiance, but because he finally had something worth smiling for. History would remember him as the shadow beside the throne. It would remember the prince who risked everything to save a